about many more. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, we see the event that a lot of people know about, an event that marks kind of one of Jesus' main miracles in the minds of a lot of people, and that is the time that Jesus walked on water. But there's also more to that story than just Jesus walking on the water. It's also a story of refuge, of a safe place in the most unlikeliest of places. You see, maybe you remember, I don't remember how long ago it was, but on the Discovery Channel, they had a TV show called The Deadliest Catch. And this TV show was based on following around Alaskan king crab fishermen. And the reason it was named Deadliest Catch is, well, of course, it's a catchy name, and it gives people the encouragement to tune in because people like drama. And TV producers like to play that kind of stuff up, of course, but the truth is that according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics, who take statistics and measure this kind of thing, that commercial fishermen and fishing is one of the most dangerous occupations in the country. In fact, their statistics state that for every 10 commercial fishing boats every year, there's a death out on the seas. And if you look at the injury rate of a commercial fisherman crew, especially during the Alaskan crab season, the injury rate is 100%, meaning at least one person gets multiple injuries, or every person of the crew gets some kind of injury, reportable injury, during the fishing season. And if you ever watch the show, it's completely understandable why. You see the waves and the rolling billows of the sea as they're out there in this terrible weather trying to bring up these traps and catch these crab. And all the while, the water is freezing, and it's freezing upon the surfaces, and they're skidding around, sliding around the surface of this boat, and it is extremely dangerous. You've got water, wind, waves, ice, and heavy machinery all combining to make a very dangerous environment. And so it's interesting, this statement that I'm about to make. Because at one point in history, actually two, but for our purposes this morning, we're going to talk about one point in history where the safest place on planet Earth was in the middle of a storm-tossed sea. Now, we wouldn't think that, right? That doesn't seem natural to us at all, because when I think of a safe place, I think about going to my home. Right? That's our safest place usually for us is within the walls of our home. We have our food there. We have water there. We have shelter from any kind of storms that might be rolling in. And in Oklahoma, typically, we might even have a storm shelter or a cellar of some kind in the backyard or even in the garage that we can retreat to in the chance or in the instance of extreme Oklahoma weather. But if you'll recall your elementary school days, perhaps you'll remember that shelter is one of the 4 basic necessities of life. For us to live, we need food, water, shelter, and clothing. There's also other models like Maslow's hierarchy of needs that say that people need safety, and I think that's true. We require safety. If we live in an area in which it is unsafe to live, people will migrate by the millions to get out of that area. We've seen that with war-torn countries where people, if they're able to pack up their belongings, they will leave because they know it's not safe. We've seen that with our refugee crisis several years ago, that people will leave everything they've ever owned, leave it behind, leave homes and houses and cars and jobs in order to make sure that their families are taken somewhere safe. But as we talked about earlier, safety at times can be found in unexpected places. We're going to turn to Matthew chapter 14 this morning. And we're going to see, I got to get this. We're going to see a place in history where shelter was found, safety was found, refuge was found, just as in all of our other previous examples, in an unlikely place. But first, before we do that, we need to understand the context in which we're going to be reading Matthew chapter 14, verse 22 on through verse 33. See, earlier on in chapter 14, we discover that how John the Baptist died. And so Jesus, upon hearing about the death of John the Baptist, he retreats. He wants to go off alone to his own place in order to mourn and to pray and to mourn the loss of John the Baptist. But the people, they see him and they follow along. They see him on the boat. They follow along as he's going to a remote place, and they don't leave him alone so that he can mourn. Instead, they sit around and they want to hear Jesus teach. And of course, this is the scene, the setting of Jesus feeding the multitudes with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And we know that miracle. We've heard about that before. And we understand how Jesus takes this little amount of food, feeds the multitudes of people, and then they take up 12 baskets afterward. And because of this miracle, the people want to rush him and to make him king. They want to set him up as their worldly, earthly ruler. After all, a man who can feed us in this way, he's the one we want to be over us. And so we see a miracle happen. But Jesus didn't come to be an earthly king. He didn't come to be a worldly king. And so he decides to send the disciples away and to withdraw from that place so that he can go off and pray. And he puts them in a boat and he sends them across the sea to Capernaum. And so he leaves them to row across the sea, and he goes up to the mountain to pray. That's what we're going to see picking up here in verse 22. And we're going to see the danger. Now, all throughout all of these lessons that we've gone through, when we've talked about refuge, we've talked about the danger, we've talked about the command, the obedience, and eventually the refuge that God provided to his people. We're going to discover the danger here in Matthew chapter 14 and verse 22. It says, "Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the 4th watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost!' And they cried out in fear." Now, if you look at verses 22 through 25, we understand that the time that has passed from the time that Jesus dismissed his disciples and told them to go across the sea to the time that we read here that he comes upon them, there's a drastic time difference that has elapsed. Oftentimes, I think we overlook that fact. But we understand that if you look at the Sea of Galilee, if you look at how far across this is, the distance from where they might have been to where they were going, my best guess is that the distance would have been roughly 6 miles that they needed to cross this sea. Now, I looked it up.